Thanks for joining the reviewer checklist talk. I'd like to share a little secret, and this secret is not that one, but is that I hate code review. I think that code review is very boring sometimes, and it's challenging. I believe that probably nobody really likes code review. Actually, a question for you, who likes code review? Show of hands? Nobody, almost. So probably that's why I'm sharing this talk. But probably I should ask also other questions, like, do you really think that code review improves only software quality? Do you think that you are able to speed up your reviewing process without decreasing the quality of your code? I'll answer to those questions during the course of this talk. But before, let me introduce myself. I'm Nicola Pietroluongo. I'm working at the Royal Opera House. And at the Royal Opera House, of course, we are using Symfony, a composer, to orchestrate our web application. I have a lot of interest in open source project, machine learning, artificial intelligence, but most important for this talk, in my over 10 years of professional PHP experience, I reviewed tons of lines of code. I'm also the author of Learning PHP 7 by Packet Publishing. So this talk is composed by three main areas: an introduction to code review, what it is, type of code review, the checklist, the juicy part, with snippets of code and areas like architecture, best practices. And at the end, we will see some tools, and we will draw some conclusion. So let's start with what code review is. This is the definition that comes from Wikipedia with a little adjustment. So code review is a systematic examination of source code, intending to find mistakes in the initial development phase, improving the overall quality of team and software. I strongly believe that code review can improve also the team expertise. And you will see this line all over my talk. So let's see what are the types of code review, or what are the most common types of code review. The first one is called formal inspection, or Fagan inspection, named after Michael Fagan. I left a few links underneath, just because if you are searching for Michael Fagan from UK, you will find a weird story about a man entering in the Queen's bedroom in the 1982. And this is a different kind of inspection. It's more structured, about planning, overview, preparation, rework. Was, I think, first publicized in the IBM journal in the 1976, when actually the code didn't have a lot of guidelines as we have right now. The second type of code review is the over-the-shoulder review, when the developers walks the reviewer through the code. So you have kind of real-time chat. You can address the things face-to-face. Then we have the pull request. Pull request, probably I don't have to explain what is pull request, but it's a part of something also called tool-assisted review, because actually you use a tool. You can use GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket. So you can submit your pull request, and someone else, also from the other part of the world, can comment your code. And then we have pair programming. Pair programming, so two developers are coding at the same workstation. Real-time programming, real-time feedback. The main difference between the code review I mentioned actually is about the time. The best review is the one that keeps those three main areas close to each other. And this happens in pair programming. So, don't know if actually who pairs here? Show of hands. Should pair more, but actually pair programming is not for everybody, probably we know that, but has strong advantages when it comes to code review. General rules. There are some general rules you can follow in your code review sessions. The first one actually is share interesting findings. As a reviewer, but also as a developer, every time you see something that can be shared with the rest of your team, I mean, do it, because you have always to try to increase the overall team knowledge. So it's not about a one-to-one, it's not about only myself and stuff. You have to share as much as you can. Another important suggestion comes when you are speaking about time. Time is extremely important. Those are kind of metrics that are generally accepted. You should actually spend the right amount of time in your review process. Usually, in 1 hour, you are able to review 200, 250 lines of code. You shouldn't go over 400 lines of code simply because your concentration will drop. And again, quick feedback. Quick feedback is really important because you don't want to block the team's velocity. Another suggestion is you can collect metrics. Metrics are really important. First, because are metrics that they can tell you what your code does, but also what your team does, because the code actually is produced by your team. Those are kind of metrics that you can collect: lines of code, the number of lines of code, function point, the business functionalities. Defect density and risk density is about the amount of defect as a reviewer you can spot. And risk density is like defect density, but the defects are rated by risk, so you can have low, medium, and high. Code coverage, the amount of code covered by test. Defect detection rate and defect correction rate. Again, amount of defect in a time unit and amount of correction in a time unit. And at the end, cyclomatic complexity. We will see in a bit what a cyclomatic complexity is. You might say, yeah, but those metrics are used by tester. That's true, but you have also to think about defect not only as a bug, but can be also a code violation. Most of those things can be automated, so you don't have to write or count the lines of code. There are tools. We will see some tools at the end. So I said I want to introduce briefly cyclomatic complexity because it's very important, I think, and you will find that in a lot of tools. Cyclomatic complexity, Thomas McCabe, again, 1976. Everything seems to happen around the 76, this marvelous 70. This is its formula, but mainly the idea behind the cyclomatic complexity is that not only can register the complexity of your code, but also can spot the number of independent paths your code can execute. The idea behind is your code can be described as a graph. So on the right, a graph can have statements, so your code has statements, and those are the nodes, and also connection between those nodes, and those are the edges. This is the formula. We have edges minus nodes plus 2 multiplied by number of exit points. Number of exit points in a function, we have one return value. P is always equal 1. Sometimes P is also called predicates. Again, I'm going a little bit faster on cyclomatic complexity, so sorry if I miss the big picture, but I want just to give a general idea. Let's see an example. This is a representation of a couple of ifs. So we can count the statement. So the nodes, the shapes are 6. The edges, the connection, are 7. And here we go. The formula returns 3. 3 is the minimum number of independent paths this code can run. The first one is the true. Now the true and the true. The second one is the true and the false. And the third one is just the false. So we have actually the number 3. This number 3 is also important because you can understand, for example, how many tests you have to write to cover the 100%, to have 100% coverage of this function. So cyclomatic complexity is useful for a lot of things, but also to spot the complexity of your code. For example, if it's this value, if it's not higher than 10, is a pretty good value, but also can help you to understand the amount of tests you should write. This is another suggestion, is a bug hunt, not a blame game. Who remember Full Metal Jacket? Hartman, Gunnery, is that you, John Wayne? Nobody remembers it? So the point is nobody wants to be like, if you remember the movie, like Private Pile, no? Be nice and friendly. This is a bit of an easy suggestion. Be nice and friendly in your comments. Be nice and friendly with your peers. Don't blame the people, but blame the processes. So now, when quickly decline. I'm assuming during the course of the talk that we are using the pull request, because as we saw, probably the pull request via some tools is the slowest form of code review. So this is kind of a game time, because I'll start to have some question, and you should complete this sentence using only 2 words: approve and decline. Do not count the lines, because approve and decline have same length, so don't count the line. So the point is, when the pull request is out of scope, what you should do? You should decline. Why? Out of scope, it means that I'm reviewing some code that tries to address more problem that the business needs. Imagine you have an agile board, there is some ticket, I want to fix the problem X, and the code that I'm reviewing fixes other problem, also something that I was not expected. You have to decline because the developer probably is using wrongly the company's time because tries to address something that is not needed. Also, is going to use probably, wrongly the time of the reviewer, because as a reviewer, I have to review more than I really need. And then I add more confusion. And confusion is also can return into bugs. Another simple question. When the code has no test coverage, what you should do? You should decline. It's really easy. Do not promote to production if you don't have test coverage. The last one of the list, when you don't like the solution provided, what you should do when you don't like as a reviewer? Nothing. It's not about personal feeling. It's about always kind of structured process. If the solution provided is valid, technically valid, formally valid, you have to approve it. You can speak, you can share your knowledge with the developer if you are the reviewer. This little game was just to highlight how the reviewer role is important. You have the possibility to decline, to approve. So you are the power, actually, to promote to production. You are a kind of gatekeeper for the outside world. A little bit like UK border force. I don't know, I would also say code Brexit, but probably it's not the case. The point is, the difference is that everybody plays in the same team. So everybody is a part of the same team. It's not the reviewer against the developer. So we arrive to the checklist, and so the juicy part, as I said. And we will see those main areas, so things around best practices, foundation architecture as some keys area. We'll start from a smaller scope, from the function method scope, and we will increase until we will arrive to the architectural level. So best practices. Best practices as a procedure to write less complex and clean code. So we are talking about solid principle, single responsibility, open close, risk of substitution, interface segregation, and dependency inversion. We are talking about keys. Keep it simple, dry, don't repeat yourself. There are a lot of books, a lot of literature, clean code as well. There are a lot of books around clean code and stuff. So as a reviewer, you have to enforce those practices. But not only practices around PHP and coding is also practice. I mean, we are talking about also practices within our Symfony framework. This is an example of service configuration. I'm just comparing the 2.8 against the Symfony 3.3. So in the 2.8, the documentation says, keep your service name short. In the 3.3, we can use the fully qualified name because we have the short syntax. This is just an example to compare what 2.8 says and what 3.3 says. Also, we saw this morning, the Symfony 4, we also changed a little bit the things. So there is this slightly, I would say, changes over the time that Symfony also provides and suggests. Why? I feel like it's a little bit like the bubble wrap story. So bubble wrap, literally the bubble wrap that you like to explode when you were kids, was invented in the 1957 as wallpaper. So imagine, bubble wrap as a wallpaper. I don't know if you have to put some picture on the wall, what's going to happen. But started to be used in a proper way only when IBM shipped one of their first computer, and they start to use with bubble wrap as a shipping method. So the story that I'm trying to take out and I'm trying to highlight is the Symfony community and also your team should use the things based on the real usage. Yes, there is a suggestion, but if for me it makes more sense to change slightly this suggestion, I should go for it. It should be more meaningful for my business, for my team. An example is I really like to use controller as a service. Controller as a service from the Symfony until I think the Symfony 3.3. The documentation marked this practice as not officially recommended. So controller as a service, not officially recommended, because it's complex, because add more verbosity and other things. But I would show you how controller as a service And then after Symfony 3.3, actually, also the controller is a service. So again, we see this kind of bubble wrap things. I want to show you why, in my opinion, is really good things, also from a reviewer point of view. So this is an example. OK, this is another slide. This is an example of a controller as a service. So we have an event controller. We have a constructor. I forgot to say controller as a service with dependency injection by constructor. That's probably the most useful way. So we have a templating engine, a router engine, logger interface, event repository, and the index action accept an ID. I can guess, and I bet that everybody could understand what this index action is going to do. We have a template engine, so probably twig. Router interface, the router class, probably there is some URL change. Logger interface, gonna be some logging. Event repository is the event controller. There is an ID, doctrine query. So with 4 lines, I can understand what the index action does without reading the index action. That's why, from my point of view, controller as a service also is a powerful thing, and it's very easy to review a controller controller as a service class. And we arrive to another layer of checks called foundation. Foundation because we should also enforce the ins and out, the core functionality of our application. With ins and out, I'm talking also about parameters and return values, so how the application communicates. I like also to enforce defensive programming when I review the code. I'm not going to go deeper in defensive programming, but actually one of the suggestions is around parameters and return values. This is what I meant. So if I start to inject mixed value and a return, mixed things, I don't know how to handle this class. I don't know how to test this class. I add confusion. Instead, I should use, for the return value, value object, class. Also, I personally hate arrays. I don't think it's a good thing to return an arrays. We can use, instead, object-oriented programming. I mean, PHP by itself has the iterator aggregator interface that extend the traversable interface. So you can actually use also a class, and you can use a for with a class. It's much more structured. PHP 7 can help a lot, because you can start to adopt the type hinting as well. Dependency constraint is another check that I like to validate. Probably I would like to use this image as an example. Imagine you have a line of dominoes on your desk, and there is one piece that is a little bit clunky. No? It works, stays there, but it's a little bit clunky. I wouldn't clone this piece and use this piece in another part. So this piece is your legacy code that probably is not well tested. This piece, this clunky piece, probably is a dependency that you want to add. Again, be aware about legacy code. Probably was written years ago by I don't know who. You have to revalidate your legacy code. It's not because you are pressured that you don't want to repeat yourself. You have to use all the rubbish you can find in your code base. So revalidate the dependencies, but also be sure that the composer dependencies are right. Use some stable dependencies, some stable release. I mean, nobody wants to experience what happened with Node a few months ago when one developer broke Node because of the dependencies. I don't think in PHP will happen, but again, another suggestion. As a reviewer, you should be aware and try to suggest alternatives in deprecation. Okay, this is a little cameo from Nicolas. But the point is, about deprecations with Symfony is pretty easy, because there are libraries also they are checking for deprecation, and sometimes some Symfony version also has raise some notice, so you can just switch on the web debug toolbar. But about alternatives, you should know how Symfony works. I mean, the main idea is that in the 90% of the case, there is a Symfony component that does the work for you. Let's make an example. I don't know how many of you is using JSON decode function, the JSON decode PHP function. Probably, if you are not using, you are going to use. So you might know that the JSON decode function is a PHP function. It can return a true false, but also null. Null in case of error. If you want to handle the error in a proper way, you should call the JSON last error function that is another PHP function. I mean, instead of adding these things and to create a class, Symfony already has the JSON decoder class that by default, I mean, already has this built-in functionality that does the checks for you. So you can just use this class instead, using alternatives. And as I said, in the 90% of the case, there is something already fixed or already solved by Symfony. Just read the documentation, inspect the code, and you will find out. Test. Sorry that the slide is a little bit cut. Test, because you should review the test too. I'm not going deeper into the test because, I mean, probably would take another conference. But personally, as a reviewer, I like to start from the test. I review the test first, before the actual class, because I believe if the test is clear, concise, and meaningful, it's more likely that the class is also meaningful and clean too. So I really prefer to start from the test. Architecture, another layer of checks. So architecture has interaction between your system and other system, like API calls, database calls, anything. Yeah, okay, never assume anything. This actually is a good suggestion. What I meant is, imagine you have to review some code, some service that calls a Twitter API. As a reviewer, I should know how this Twitter API works. You might say, yeah, but in my team, we have a perfect specification, our acceptances criteria are brilliant, and nothing can go wrong. Sure, it's never like that, never. Even if it's like that, as a reviewer, I should validate. I should point it out if the documentation is still valid, if the Twitter API, in case, doesn't have a better version. So as a reviewer, I should also don't assume anything. Don't take everything as it is. To bundle or not to bundle, that is a question. This probably doesn't happen anymore because with the newer version of Symfony, you tend to do not use bundle. But who might use the Symfony before, also older version, used to bundle a lot, I mean, to create a lot of bundles. We know that in the 90% of the case, your bundle is coupled with your business logic. The point is, the bundle should be something that you should share with someone else. You cannot just bring the bundle and share with another company. I mean, it's really never like that. So stop bundle. This is the Symfony demo application structure. So you can see there is just one bundle, the app bundle. The point is what I have to do as a reviewer. I have to review the namespace. I have to review the architecture. If there is a new class, I need to understand if this is the right place in which this class should stay. So also review the namespace. Spend time to try to understand if the name also is meaningful. Those are the bricks of your building. So don't just leave the things as they are. Key areas. Key areas, we are talking about some level of checks that are valid all over the layer we saw before. So it's not another layer, but those are valid everywhere. We are talking about security, logging, and performances. About security, this is an example, another example. Imagine you are going to review a form, and this form has, you might know that this form needs a CSRF token, cross-site request forgery. I'm not going to talk about the cross-site request forgery, but let's just assume that we need a token automatically and randomly generated every time, so at every request or at every session. So you know this as a reviewer. You check the code. You see that everything fine. The token is configured in the security YAML. You have also the CSRF token here in the tweak template. As a reviewer, I can say, yeah, everything is fine. But what if the page is cached? So actually, the token is always the same. The point is, if you are not aware about what can be a security vulnerability, how can you review a security vulnerability? That's probably the main issue. Open Web Application Security Project just released the code review guide for security. This is a very interesting PDF. It's recently. They released it recently. It's all about security. I think, yeah, it's worth a read. It's great. It's a great PDF. It's a great document. Logging. We arrive to logging. So we know that Symfony comes with monologue. Monologue sustained the PSR3 logger interface. The logger interface enforce what is defined in the RFC 5424. What I want to say. Those are the levels you should use. I saw many times that the log is misused in excess, but also in the opposite way. The main, I think, confusion comes on the bottom area. Oh, sorry. On the bottom area. So we are talking about warning, notice, informational, and debug. Please, do not enable debug in production. Don't enable debug in production. Add only a lot of noise. Is a mess then to understand what's going on. So let's talk about informational, notice, and warning. Informational, you should log something like the cron has started, order processed, something like that. Notice something a little bit more significant, like the customer ID variable is empty. Warning, again, more prominent, like I cannot write in the cache directory, or I cannot write in the upload directory. So what's the rule about logging? Think what you're going to do when you see the log. If it's informational, nothing. If it's notice, probably nothing. If it's a warning, in the case of the cache, you should take an action. That's the rule. Again, if you log less, log more. If you log more, try to filter what are you logging. By experience, I tend to log at least when I call external API. Like in the Twitter example, I would call the pre-request and also the post-request. And as a reviewer also, if you see that there is some log missing that should be there, you should enforce this practice. Okay, I can even start to sing probably now. I want it all, I want it now. Performances, not my performance because it's rubbish, but performances in the meaning of speed. We know that years ago, one metric to evaluate a software was its functionality. It works, I use it. It works, I buy it. Now performances are more important probably than the functionality. I mean, we know that, for example, mobile users are even less patient. So I wouldn't say that you have to worry a lot about performances because you are not doing a load test against your application. But in the review process, you can spend a couple of seconds to understand what are the quirk. This is 2 loops. So we have a for loop with a count function inside the loop. The second loop has the count function outside. You can imagine that this function, that the loop A, is more slow because it repeats the count function every time. So again, we shouldn't be too much worried probably about performances nowadays because there is cloud computing. Our applications are able to scale. But this is a little check that everybody can do. And usually it's always about loops, arrays, database, call, API calls, cache as much as you can, validate, and everything. If you want to do a quick check, it's 1 second, the Symfony profiler. You switch on the Symfony profiler, you see what's going on. Once I discover one API called twice, just looking at the Symfony profiling, it's 1 second. I mean, going ahead, a little bit of tools. So we mentioned performances. Blackfire, something that everybody can use. We have also the standout side. SymfonyLive Insight, a static analyzing tool that can be used also for private projects. This is one of my public open source project. This is about a fake data generation tool. Every time I commit my stuff, it runs and can also tell me what's going on with my code. PHP coding standard fixer, probably everybody knows this. I think it's a great tool. It's one of my favorites, probably. Fixes the code style for you. So I don't have to be worried about reading if I missed a new line or something. That's another problem. Stop to try to review the coding standard or these kind of basic things. Try to be more high level. I mean, to review something that is more at higher level. Another tool is Hexacat. This is an all-in-one tool. It claims to have 100%, more than 100% rules. And PHP metrics also, very, very, very great, I think, because can also show you the relationship between your objects. It's very cool. And again, in these tools also you'll find out what is a cyclomatic complexity. Those also are returning lines of code, some cyclomatic complexity, all the most of the things that we saw before. And PHP mess detector, you might know that, also based on PHP depend. This is a command line tool. The point is automate as much as you can. I want to show you actually how automation also, it's very easy. You don't need to install everything. It's really basic things to do. Let's bring the example of PHP mess detector. PHP mess detector can scan, again, one file, can scan a list of files, comma separated, or can scan an entire directory. I don't want to run against my entire directory because I want just to review my little file, the 4 file that I changed in my pull request. So how can I do that? I know that PHP mess detector runs against a comma-separated list of file. I'm using git diff. I run a git diff between my branch and probably the master branch. These parameters ensure that I'm excluding the deleted file, because otherwise PHP mess detector cannot find the deleted file. So I have a new line separated list. How can I convert new line into comma separated list? With sed, in this way. So, I mean, I just show in just 3 slides, in 3 seconds, how you can run in automation something that enforces your review process. This is the all-in-one command. Should be all in one line. So, I mean, again, automate as much as you can, because it's really important, and because automation can take over the reviewer responsibilities. If you are brave enough, you can even start to use something called light touch review. Light touch review is about to just check what are the criticalities around your code. So just high-level things. You don't have to read the code line by line, because you have automation. Those are the rules that you should enforce. Otherwise, you cannot review code. You must have some tools that automate partially your checks. You should have high test coverage. So, I mean, you minimize the bug in production. Your pull request or your release has to be small and contained, easier to handle. And again, this is very important, I think. The general knowledge of the project, of the businesses, of their general practices should be spread equally around your team. Because it's not true that only senior developers are able to review the code. Everybody should be able to review the code. What if the senior developer is sick? So that's the point. The general knowledge should be spread. That's why it's very important to share interesting findings. So I have a last question for you. Who likes code review now? Show of hands. OK, good. Great improvement, guys. Actually, with this answer, you just reviewed the code review talk. Thanks.